Hello, everybody. We are continuing on with our Unit 1 review, our Foundations of American Democracy review. Last video, we looked at the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Today, we're moving on with Principles of American Government. So, today, we're talking about the Principles of American Government. We're really talking about checks and balances and separation of powers. So today, the learning objective, there's two of them. The first one says that students will be able to explain the constitutional principles of separation of powers and checks and balances, right? So separation of powers, we're taking the powers of government and dividing it amongst three branches, right? That the legislative branch, created in Article 1 of the Constitution, is responsible for making and passing all laws in the United States, right? That's their power, that's their job. Article 2 establishes the executive branch, and the executive branch is responsible for carrying out the laws passed by Congress, right? So that's their job, is to make sure that the laws are effectively and efficiently carried out in the United States. And then the third branch, the judicial branch, is there to interpret the Constitution, right? Federal Number 78, and that the Supreme Court is the weakest of the three branches because their job is merely to interpret the Constitution. They have neither the power of the purse, right, lawmaking ability, the ability to delegate funds, or nor the sword, the power to enforce and carry out those laws. So that is separation of powers. You have the three-branch government and the three powers given to them. The legislative branch makes the laws, passes laws. The executive branch carries out the laws, and the judicial branch is there to interpret the laws, right? And then also in the Constitution, you have a series of checks and balances, right? Checks and balances, how each branch is responsible for controlling and making sure that the other branches do not become too powerful, right? Controlling and making sure the other branches do not become too powerful. And these are powers given to the branches in the Constitution, right? So if we talk about some of the key legislative checks, right, things that the legislative branch can do, the legislative branch can override a presidential veto, right? Presidential vetoes can be overridden with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, right? Congress also has the power to impeach. They can impeach and remove president, vice president, right? Key members of the bureaucracy. All federal judges can be impeached. And remember, impeachment is a two-step process. It starts in the House of Representatives. So the House can impeach an official, bring charges against an official with a majority vote. And the Senate can remove an impeached official with a 2/3 vote, right? So majority vote in the House will impeach and bring charges against an official, and then the trial will move to the Senate, where 2/3 of senators, if they convict that official, can remove that person from office. Remember, now 3 presidents have been impeached, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump, but neither of them were removed from office. So they were impeached by the House, majority vote in the House, but neither received the 2/3 vote to remove them from office, right? Legislative branch can propose amendments. We talked about this in the last video, right? That Congress, if 2/3 of Congress votes to propose an amendment, they can propose an amendment, and that could possibly check the judicial branch, because the judicial branch's job is to interpret the Constitution, right? So a good example of this is Supreme Court rules in Dred Scott versus Sandford back in early 1800s, right? That slaves are not people. They are possessions of their slave owners, right? So Congress, about 100 years later, no, not 100 years later, but about 40 years later, after the Civil War, Congress proposes the 15th Amendment, which says that any person born or naturalized in the United States is a U.S. citizen, right? So it's proposed by Congress to make sure that all former slaves are citizens, that are considered citizens of the United States, overturning the Dred Scott decision, right? Congress can also control the jurisdiction of all federal courts, right? So they're responsible for creating inferior courts. They can't create another Supreme Court, but they can create other district and courts of appeals, district courts and court of appeals, right? They can control the jurisdiction of those lower courts as given to them by the Constitution. President enters into treaties with foreign countries, right? As the diplomatic leader, the foreign diplomacy or foreign diplomatic leader, he can enter into treaties with other countries, but those treaties must be confirmed by the Senate, right? The Senate, 2/3 of the Senate must vote to approve all presidential treaties. Also, that goes along with confirmation of all presidential appointments, right? President appoints all federal court judges, right? Supreme Court judges, appellate court judges, and district court judges. But all key presidential appointments must be approved by a majority vote of the Senate, right? The Senate confirmation of all presidential appointments, a majority vote of the Senate is necessary to approve those key appointments, right? I think that's about all of them for the legislative branch, right? The executive branch, there's really a couple key ones here, right? The power to appoint. They can appoint all federal judges. So the Supreme Court judges there's no requirements for those judges. There's no constitutional requirements, but the only requirement is that they be appointed by the president and then confirmed by a majority vote of the Senate. And that goes with all the bureaucratic heads, right? The heads of the departments. The 15 executive departments are all appointed by the president, but confirmed by the Senate. So the Senate kind of has final say on those appointments. And the president can also veto, right? Can veto legislation. So if Congress passes a bill, right, the president can veto that bill if he sees it to be unfit with his interpretation and understanding of the Constitution. And again, that veto can be overridden. I don't know if I talked about this, but Congress can override a presidential veto, right, with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, right? So that's a kind of Congress's check, is that they can override presidential vetoes. And then also, I didn't mention, but a key one is that the president, the executive branch, and Congress, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, both of those are relied on to carry out the Supreme Court's decision, right? So depending on if or how they decide to carry out those decisions can often have a big impact on whether those decisions get implemented, right? Look at the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. No, I'm sorry. Plessy versus Ferguson, which created segregation, right, separate but equal, and then the Brown versus Board, which overturned that, right? Brown versus Board was very unpopular in the South, and many southern states failed to carry that decision out, right? They failed to desegregate. And it wasn't until Congress stepped in and President Eisenhower steps in and sends the National Guard down to Little Rock High School, and Congress officially passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to basically carry out and enforce the Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? So both legislative branch and the executive branch are necessary and required to carry out and enforce the Supreme Court rulings. And then they can choose whether or how they do that, right? And then the judicial branch, the key one here is judicial review, right? Don't forget Marbury versus Madison, a required Supreme Court case. Marbury versus Madison establishes this concept of judicial review, which basically allows the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress and actions of the executive branch and the president, right? So Congress can declare laws, I take that back. The Supreme Court can declare laws passed by Congress and actions of the executive branch and the president unconstitutional, right? So if Congress passes a law that the Supreme Court sees as unconstitutional, they can overturn that law, right? If the president does something that the Supreme Court feels he is overstepping his constitutional rights, the Supreme Court can overturn those actions and declare those unconstitutional under this concept of judicial review. So that's the big one there. All right, so that basically sums up the power of separation of powers and checks and balances, right? Federalist number 51, right? Another key required document, foundational document, which basically says that there's this fear that a strong national government is only going to impose on the rights of the people, right? And is going to create abuses of power and abuses of majorities, right? That majorities will abuse their power and people will get elected into office and will do so with ill intentions, right? But Federalist 51 says don't worry about that because of this system of separation of powers. We're going to divide power amongst three branches and checks and balances. We're going to ensure that no person or branch becomes too powerful through both of those. So it advocates for separation of powers and checks and balances to prevent abuses of the majority. And then the last learning objective is explain the implications of separation of powers and checks and balances for the U.S. political system. So that kind of falls into that, Federalist number 51. And then impeachment, removal, and other legal actions taken against public officials deemed to have abused their power reflect the purposes of checks and balances. And I kind of highlighted impeachment in the checks and balances, right? That Congress can impeach the president, as we saw just this past year, right? We're living history with the impeachment of the president and a failure of the Senate to convict the impeached president of removal or convict him of the crimes to remove him, right? And then also Supreme Court judges, right? Supreme Court judges are granted 10-year lifetime terms, right? Lifetime terms on the basis of good behavior. So if they do their job and they do it without treason, bribery, other high crimes or misdemeanors, right? They can be removed. They can be removed through the impeachment process, right? But that is basically there's no term limits for them. They serve for a life as long as they want on these terms of good behavior, as long as they basically don't get impeached. So that basically sums up the principles of American government, checks and balances, separation of powers. Keep studying, keep working hard. Proud of you all, and I miss you. Hopefully you all are doing well. So take care. Bye.